week, we're going to try something a little bit different. Fun little activity to get to know your host a little bit better.
Everybody has a different talent. For me, it just happens to be art. But, with any talent comes hardships and certain difficulties. So, I've decided to make a list. Top 10 annoying things to draw. At least for me. Crap. 10 is eyes. Yeah, these things. The little vision things that let you see in life. Personally, I don't have too much of a problem drawing eyes, but if you screw them up just a little bit and you get them a little bit off balance, you end up looking with a really weird, wacky looking face. You see, we can detect really subtle differences. So if you put your eyes a little bit too wide apart, they end up looking alienish. Too close together, and they just kind of come off as just weird looking beings. It's all about maintaining a certain balance to where the eyes are. Sometimes your hand will just kind of naturally slant them, and you get one eye that's a little higher than the other. And that just looks really weird. So it's all about maintaining this perfect sort of balance between eye locations, It especially gets annoying though when you work so hard on a picture and you finish it and everything, and then you realize how wacky your eyes look.
Basically, even if it's a really subtle difference, a little change in eyes can literally screw up your entire picture.
You might be a little bit surprised at this being so far up on the list, especially for a lot of people. They struggle with drawing hands, and that's completely understandable. Personally, I don't have too much of an issue drawing hands, but when you start getting into the weirder positions, then they start getting clumsy. For one example, you've got the fist. Another one, you've got outstretched hands, or maybe even a hand holding on to something. These are really quick sketches, but it doesn't change the fact that these things are just weird to draw. Like, you've got 5 fingers, all basically cylinders, and it complicates things when you have an object in between, and you have to make it look like it's wrapping around it. It's just a mess, honestly. Now, number 8 mostly depends on the situation. Personally, I'm not the absolute greatest at drawing clothes, but it mostly comes down to wrinkles and stuff like that.
Now, clothes are a bit of an interesting subject because, we wear clothes every day and we see everybody with clothes. But, just because you see something every day doesn't really make it any easier to draw.
So, for the most part, clothing isn't necessarily the hardest thing to illustrate. Sometimes it mostly gets tricky when you enter situations like this, where it's in a very dynamic pose, and trying to create believable wrinkles can be a bit difficult, especially when you're like me, where I try to visualize clothing as sort of just a bunch of rectangles. There's a big issue with visualizing clothing like rectangles, because if you do that, it tends to look a little bit sort of stilty, really rigid and immovable. Even though in real life, clothing is very flexible. It's mostly curvish, and there's a lot of wrinkles in between as the surfaces kind of change. And it really just comes down to studying a lot and just watching and learning and copying from pictures. But that doesn't change, it's still really annoying for me, just because I guess I just don't practice enough to draw clothing. So my issue with number 7 is mostly the inner workings and the anatomy of it, but it's basically this amazing thing called an elbow. Now what I typically do is I try to simplify the shapes a little bit, and for elbows, basically So first you have the arm, right here you have the whole bicep and all that fancy business there. But when you move to the elbow, it sort of becomes this triangle almost, kind of like this, And it gets a little bit wacky when you try and apply these different muscles to it. Okay, most arms turn out kind of like this, where they just look like triangles. It's kind of wacky, but just the whole shape of the elbow can be a little bit strange, especially the anatomy. Knowing the cluster of muscles that sort of resides around here can be kind of difficult to illustrate, especially on top. Like, underneath the skin, it's easy to show the muscles, but, being able to subtly allude to them is a bit of a challenge. At least for me personally, I have a little bit of trouble just sort of deviating from the good old triangle shape of, the forearm and showing that there is a bone right here for the elbow. So I guess I might as well be blunt on number 6. Just straight up breasts or boobs, however you want to call them. So there's this misconception that, most people be like, oh, well, you just draw 2 circles, you draw the arms and everything else, and you're all good to go. Except the thing is, the human body doesn't work that way, especially for breasts. Here's a few examples of how I used to draw breasts back then, and I've gotten a bit better at it, but it's still annoying because your eye can detect very subtle differences. And so if you screw up something like breasts, if they're really separated, or if they don't even look like they're connected to the surrounding muscles and stuff like that, like it ends up looking wacky in the end. And any tiny issue with anatomy will ultimately screw up a person's the whole structure and the whole picture. And it's really crucial to get details like this down. So number 5 shouldn't even be that difficult, but I have a lot of trouble with it. Lips. So the thing with lips, like eyes, ears, or any other part of the face, is that one deviation can kind of break the illusion. And lips are especially important because they're responsible for so much of the expression in an image. So for me, even today, I can't really draw like legitimate lips. I kind of just draw a line and that. And it's kind of annoying because of how important it is to the image. You can't get a certain expression unless you draw the lips and the mouth just right. And because I suck at it, it gets a little frustrating when I have to repeatedly draw the mouth like 15 different times just to get it right. Now, number 4 is definitely a tricky one for I'd say a good chunk of people. It's this amazing thing that we have on our heads called hair.
A lot of times you'd see people try and draw every tiny strand on hair, and it ends up looking like a big mop just on their head. And I ran into that problem a lot back then.
Yeah, it's one thing to just not be good at hair and stuff, and eventually you'll get better at it. But in my case though, it held me back for years. Everything else I'd try and get down, and the hair would just always look really messy and just kind of sloppy, and like it looked like that. Honestly, a little bit of shading and bam, that's how you do it. And that held me back for a really long time, and it wasn't even until this year, I think, that I finally managed to get a hold of it. And so now we enter my top 3, and this is where things get really fuzzy for me, because I can't do any of these nowadays. If you can try and make out whatever this is, if you guessed it was a bird, then you're right.
At this point, I pretty much can't really illustrate it. I still can't, because for me, animals in general have been a big pain in the ass. Like, I cannot draw birds for the life of me. Every time I try to draw birds, they would just kind of end up like those two squiggle lines that you always see on like paintings and drawings, and like the two really simplified lines that would just symbolize birds.
So, number 2 kind of ties into to number 3 because of the fact that it's still nature and I can't draw animals. This one, dogs. Just straight up, not even an illustration anymore, just dogs.
So, obviously, people love animals, and you know, every time I'd run into a friend who would ask me to like maybe draw something for them, or like a little kid or something like that, sometimes they'd ask like, hey, can you draw a dog or like a cat or just some tiny little doodle like an animal? And it'd be really tough because I can't draw it. Like I tried learning dogs at some point. I even have 2 pet dogs, but for some reason it doesn't click for me, and it's the most annoying thing ever because every time I try to draw like a fictional setting or like a background or any type of environment that involves, you know, animals and such, it's kind of impossible. Really.
So, now we move on to the final most annoying thing that I try to draw, and that is these things. Feet. Now, don't get me wrong. I've tried. I've tried studying the anatomy of a foot, and you know, I sort of have it down, but ultimately though, the reason why this is the most annoying thing to draw is because of the ubiquitous nature of it. You know, every time you illustrate a full body character, you need all of their body parts, including their feet. And you know, oftentimes if you want to include something like shoes, or if you're trying to describe a certain character but you can't draw whatever stuff they wear on their feet or anything like that, it's really troublesome and honestly extremely inconvenient at times.
You know, running back to my my example with the eyes thing, with feet, I always try and find ways to sort of avoid it, kind of like in this picture with how I just kind of covered it up in water.
But yeah, the main issue though, for me, it lies in the structure of how a foot is like. You have this part right here, which is sort of like the arch of the foot. You have this one bone here, and then you have the 5 toes. And you know, it's already hard enough to draw a hand. To try and draw 5 toes as well, I mean, I get that they're all in a very linear pattern, but it becomes really inconvenient, especially when you start bending and contorting the foot. Then I don't know how to draw feet, and I always run into this issue every time I do a full body image of any character. I cover up their feet somehow because it's just impossible for me. I have to definitely study a bit more before I understand this mess.
Alright, so that basically concludes today's video. Top 10 most annoying things that I run into when drawing. If you like this content, go ahead and press that subscribe button, come back next week, tell your friends about it, tell your whole family about it. This channel is it's a great time for everyone. See you guys next time.